In the dense forest, the sun shines down, cut into pieces by the dense leaves, falling from the gaps, forming dots of light spots on the ground, making the environment extremely quiet. In the quiet forest, the sound of footsteps suddenly came from far and near. Suddenly, 5 figures appeared on the dense trees. They tapped their feet lightly and flew past at a very fast speed in a few ups and downs, trying to escape from here. The faces of the 5 people all had a look of anxiety, and they looked back from time to time, as if something terrible was chasing them. After jumping up and down in the forest again for a certain distance, several people looked at each other, slowed down, and landed. The young man at the head took a breath and said with a sense of survival, "It was so dangerous. I didn't expect that our team would directly collide with a team of old students. If we hadn't run so fast, we might have fallen into their hands." On the side, a girl with a somewhat delicate appearance put one hand on her regretful chest and said with lingering fear, "Yeah, if it weren't for another freshman team that happened to attract their attention, I'm afraid we would have been caught up." Just when they were rejoicing, one of them suddenly narrowed his pupils and raised his head to look at the branches above. But at the same time, a joking voice slowly sounded from above their heads. "Hey, you really have a leisurely mood. How many of you are there?" The few people who had just lamented their escape felt as if they had been poured cold water on them. They suddenly became alert, took a few steps back, and quickly raised their heads. On the big tree above their heads, on the originally empty branches, 5 people appeared at some point, either sitting, squatting, or standing leaning on it. With a few, he looked at the group of freshmen below with a very amused expression. "You actually caught up with me?" The young man in the lead lowered his face and said in a low voice, while the group of freshmen behind him involuntarily tensed up their bodies, like mice meeting a cat, very afraid. "When did you guys get the illusion that you were escaping our pursuit?" On the branch of a tree, an old student with a scar on his face said with a sinister smile, and then he shouted, "Give me your firepower, or get beaten up and give me your firepower. Choose one." The faces of the freshmen were ugly, and then the young man at the head gritted his teeth and said a few words. "Dreaming. It's impossible for me to hand over my things." Then he let out a low shout, and his fighting spirit exploded, condensing on his body. As soon as he stepped down, he punched the tree. But before he could react, the 5 people on the tree branch disappeared from his sight in the next moment, and then a huge force came from his side. Involuntarily, the young freshman, he was immediately knocked away, and the whole person crossed a distance of more than 10 meters in midair, and then fell to the ground. After rolling a few times, he hit a tree and stopped the rolling trend. At this moment, several other freshmen fell to the ground in pain and screamed, leaving only 5 old students standing there. "Haha, if you insist on asking for a fight, wouldn't it be okay if you just hand over the fire energy crystal card?" As soon as the words fell, they had already found the fire crystal card on the fallen freshman. However, at this moment, another slightly joking voice faintly resounded in the open space. "Haha, why are you seniors so leisurely?" Hearing these words, the expressions of the group of old students from the inner courtyard immediately changed, and they immediately looked towards a corner of the forest, only to find several figures wearing the clothes of freshmen from the inner courtyard slowly walking out. "Haha, who was I at that time?" It turned out that I was a freshman who didn't know the heights of the sky. The leader, the scarred old student, breathed a sigh of relief and looked at the group of freshmen who suddenly appeared with a somewhat joking smile. However, what he didn't expect was that the freshmen who had been knocked to the ground by them suddenly appeared. After seeing the few people who appeared, a flash of light burst out from his pupils, and he immediately struggled and resisted. And those figures that suddenly appeared were headed by a thin young man in black robes. He looked at the group of old students with a playful smile, as if he had seen a few walking treasures. The same, without taking the other person seriously at all. Seniors, I, Xiao Yan, will give you a chance to hand over the fire crystal card yourself, so as not to suffer a physical ordeal." The voice fell slowly, and the still noisy open space suddenly became quiet. It took more than 10 seconds for the sound to appear again. The eyes of the freshmen who fell on the ground were full of astonishment. Of course they knew that Xiao Yan was very strong, far beyond them. However, the way the other party snatched away the old students in turn prevented them from reacting. As for the group of old students, after being astonished, they became a little angry. The leader, Mr. Scar, had a cold light in his eyes and immediately sarcastically said, "A bunch of new students who don't know the heights of heaven and earth actually want to rebel against Tiangang. Let the seniors teach you what the rules of the inner courtyard are." After the words fell, Mr. Scar suddenly stepped forward, and like a sharp arrow, he suddenly rushed towards Xiao Yan. His whole body was filled with fighting energy, and golden light flashed on his fists. It was clear that he had used fighting skills. "Boy, try the senior's diamond fist." However, the moment he waved his fist, Xiao Yan suddenly moved. The next moment, Xiao Yan's figure disappeared from Scar's field of vision. The next second, the latter suddenly appeared in front of his eyes and then printed a palm on old Scar's chest. Boom! While he was hesitating in fighting spirit, the dull sound of fists and flesh was heard. Old Scar immediately spat out a mouthful of blood, his eyes widened, and his whole body was like a kite with its string broken, and he was immediately thrown far away. Team leader. The sudden change stunned all the old students and freshmen present. One old student shouted in shock. He immediately reacted and rushed towards Xiao Yan, shouting, "We have lots of ideas, let's work together." The other 3 old students also rushed towards Xiao Yan without hesitation. When the latter saw several people surrounding him again, a faint smile appeared in his eyes. He shouted low and immediately punched out. "Balong fist, break it for me." 1 against 4, after a brief contact, the 4 old students flew away under Xiao Yan's punch. With one punch, the 4 old students were defeated. Such a terrifying record made the freshmen who were still lying on the ground swallow their saliva involuntarily. Looking at the figure who slowly put away his fists, they were shocked to find that Xiao Yan seemed to be stronger than when he single-handedly challenged the entire outer courtyard on the ring. The 4 old students who were repulsed by Xiao Yan lay on the ground in a state of embarrassment, groaning in pain. However, when the scarred old man who barely got up saw the scene again, his pupils suddenly tightened, and he couldn't help but say, "Douling? How is it possible? How can there be a strong Douling among the freshmen?" Scar Laoxing himself is a great fighting master, and his 4 companions, except for the weakest one who is at the peak of fighting masters, the rest are all at the level of great fighting masters. However, with such a lineup, they join forces to attack, but however, he was defeated head-on by the leader of the opponent in the most violent way. The latter's cultivation is obviously not just that of a great fighting master. As Scar's words fell, the few old students on the ground who were still groaning in pain also fell silent. They all opened their eyes and looked at Xiao Yan, who was still calm and calm. "This new student is actually Douling. You must know that even in the inner courtyard of Canaan Academy, Douling is an extremely powerful figure and is fully qualified to be on the strong list of the inner courtyard. How is it possible that someone could become a master at the top level as soon as they enter the inner court?" For a time, the mentality of several old students collapsed. They were born in the same place, so why are there such big differences? After hearing Scar's words, Xiao Yan also raised the corners of his mouth, smiled slightly, and said, "The answer is correct, but unfortunately there is no reward. Seniors, please hand over the fire energy crystal card. I have never been a very good-tempered person." After hearing Xiao Yan's words, Scar Laoxing and others were like eggplants beaten by frost. They were all wilted. However, under Xiao Yan's smiling expression, they could only reluctantly take out their fire energy crystals. Card. Flying geese all day long, only to be blinded by swallows. This is bad luck. Mr. Scar took his fire energy crystal card and looked at the number 17 on it, which turned into 2. He immediately cursed secretly. Xiao Yan, who had collected the fire energy of several people, also chuckled. "Thank you to the seniors for their hard work, but don't worry, it's not just you. Xiao Yan, will not let go of all the old students' fire energy." As soon as he finished speaking, Xiao Yan took Sooner and others and disappeared here, deep into the forest, leaving only a few people with embarrassed expressions behind. Above the vast forest, at the top of a towering tree, two figures sat cross-legged on it. Their figures remained motionless. The breeze blew, but not even their robes could be shaken. At a certain moment, they suddenly opened their eyes and looked at each other. From each other's eyes, they could see a touch of surprise and smile. One of them was Elder Su, and the other was obviously another person from the inner courtyard. An elder. I saw him stroking his beard with a bit of a smile and said lightly, "These new students are quite interesting, especially Xiao Yan, who actually has the spirit fighting skills and even robbed the old students in the inner courtyard. Even if he is placed in the inner courtyard, his strength can be regarded as good. Now it seems that such a fire hunting competition is a bit childish for him." Elder Su nodded slowly with a slight smile and said, "Ha, this little guy named Xiao Yan is the first place in the outer courtyard competition. And not only that, he also single-handedly challenged the entire outer courtyard in the previous ranking battle and finally won." Hearing Elder Su's words, the elder's eyes once again showed a hint of surprise. Then he shook his head and said with a bit of joy, "Fortunately, the old guy Hu Qian sent me a message before, saying that this time a great person came to the outer courtyard. To be on the safe side, I even grabbed a bunch of guys from the arena to guard the gate." Hearing this, Elder Su frowned and then asked with some speculation, "Could it be the black and white evil spirits?" After hearing this, the elder immediately stroked his beard and said with a faint smile, "Of course, there are two fighting spirits among those guys. In addition, the entire team has extremely rich combat experience and a tacit understanding of cooperation. If Xiao Yan plans to fight alone, he may have to suffer a lot." Elder Su frowned and remembered the information about Xiao Yan's time in the Jiama Empire that Hu Qian had given him before. He immediately thought of it and with a bit of a smile, he said to the other elder, "Elder Huang, why don't we make a bet?" About 3 hours after the fire energy hunting competition officially started, the sky gradually darkened, but at the same time, rumors gradually began to spread in the forest. "Hey, did you hear that? There seems to be a team of freshmen chasing those old students from the inner courtyard." No way. It's that fierce man who is doing this, isn't it, that Xiao Yan? Haha, besides him being so strong, who else is there? That's awesome. It's a big break for us freshmen. We were bullied so hard by the old students, and those who couldn't beat the same level came to pick on us. We deserve to be at the bottom. As the rumors spread, many old students were still skeptical, but the freshmen were slightly startled, then reacted and got excited. Who else could be so bold? Of course, Xiao Yan took 2 years off, but when he came back, he directly challenged the entire outer courtyard and won the battle. As the old student team suffered more and more blows, the remaining old student teams realized that this was not a rumor or a joke, it was true. There really is a team of daring freshmen hunting them. For a moment, the old students who were originally relaxed and comfortable immediately united. They were not willing to endure such humiliation. There were even weak old students who spontaneously started to look for traces of the Xiao Yan team. After such a carpet-like search, they actually found something. However, when the news of the fighting came, some people looked for traces, but they could only see the old students with bruised noses and swollen faces lying on the ground, in a state of embarrassment. But the strange new team could never be seen. In addition, the defeated old students all seemed to have suffered a huge mental blow. They didn't say anything when asked, they just walked out of the forest with a gloomy face. Everyone just regarded them as. It was a huge blow, but they never thought that the defeated old students were cursing in their hearts. That new student turned out to be Dou Ling. No, we can't be the only ones to be beaten. All old students must be treated equally. In the empty forest glade, withered yellow leaves covered the ground with a thick layer, like a yellow carpet. In the quiet forest, a breeze blew by, bringing up the leaves on the ground, touching the branches and making bursts of rustling sounds. Whoosh! A sound of breaking through the air suddenly came out, advancing from a distance and suddenly expanded, and then a figure suddenly flew out from the forest, and then hit the ground heavily, and rolled around 7 or 8 times before barely stopping. Out of shape. I saw the man getting up in embarrassment, and on his chest there was a badge symbolizing the symbol of the old student of the inner courtyard of Canaan College. Normally, as an old student in the inner courtyard, he should be the one hunting. The stronger side occasionally encounters difficult new students, but at most they have to put in a few more efforts. But now he is like this, being blown away in a panic. Even his face is full of shock and panic. It is really unreasonable. Tap, tap, tap. At this moment, faint footsteps suddenly appeared from the forest, unhurried and leisurely, just like walking. However, such ordinary footsteps made this old student from the inner courtyard. He was so scared that his whole body tensed up and he assumed a fighting posture as if facing a powerful enemy. As the footsteps approached, a thin figure wearing black clothes slowly walked out from behind the forest. He had a delicate face and fair skin, and he was carrying a huge black ruler on his back that was as tall as a man. The corners of his mouth were slightly raised, and there was a faint smile. He seemed to be quite gentle, and he was a sunny and cheerful young man. But in the eyes of the old man, this young man was no less terrifying than the devil in hell. Exhaling heavily, the embarrassed old student from the inner courtyard stared at the figure and shouted in a low voice with some trembling and unwillingness. "Xiao Yan, don't go too far. This is a fire energy hunting competition, not a place for you to show off." After hearing his words, Xiao Yan stopped walking, raised his eyes to look at the old student from the inner courtyard who was half lying on the ground, raised the corners of his mouth, and said lightly with a somewhat playful smile, "Excessive? Senior, are you kidding me?" Which rule of the fire energy hunting competition states that freshmen from the outer courtyard are not allowed to take action against old students from the inner courtyard. Which rule also states that only old students from the inner courtyard are allowed to snatch the freshmen's fire energy, and freshmen are not allowed to fight back. Hearing Xiao Yan's words, the old student from the inner courtyard couldn't help but remain silent for a moment. The words he originally wanted to say were choked in his throat, and he couldn't blurt them out. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "No matter what, rules are rules, Xiao Yan. I'm afraid you don't know the news yet, right? Your behavior has aroused dissatisfaction among many people. Even the 2 teams of black and white who were supposed to be guarding the gates have learned the news and started to hunt you down. No matter how strong you are, how can you escape their hunting?" After the words fell, the old student from the inner courtyard knew that he could not avoid Xiao Yan's snatching. He immediately snorted coldly, took out his own fire energy crystal card with some heartache, and placed it on the ground. At the same time, he observed Xiao Yan. Yan's expression seemed to want to see a little panic on his face. But Xiao Yan remained unmoved. Instead, with a slight smile, he grabbed the fire energy crystal card from the air and took it into his hand, and then swiped it gently. Suddenly, another amount of fire energy was added to his account. Seeing that his fire energy had now exceeded the 200 mark, Xiao Yan smiled slightly and was in a good mood. He put his 2 fingers together and held the living energy crystal card belonging to the old man in the inner courtyard. Said calmly, "Thank you, senior, for reminding me. But what I, Xiao Yan, like the most is to say no to self-righteous people. Even if the 2 teams of black and white are blocking the front, I still want to see who the final winner is." After the words fell, Xiao Yan's fingers were slightly bent, and then he flicked, and the dark fire energy crystal card swished through the void like a flying arrow and fell into the hands of the old student from the inner courtyard. Under the latter's embarrassed expression, Xiao Yan slowly walked back to where he came from. After about a few dozen steps, an empty ground appeared in front of Xiao Yan. At this time, 5 old students with dirty and dusty faces were surrounding the city in a small circle, back to back, their eyes full of eyes, looking angrily at the 4 young people around them. Seeing Xiao Yan's arrival, Yi Ying's eyes lit up immediately. She walked towards him and said with a bit of excitement and surprise, "Brother Xiao Yan, are you back?" With a gentle smile, Xiao Yan looked at the girl, nodded slightly, and then slowly told the people beside him. Everyone, there is bad news and good news next. Which one do you want to hear first? Baishan on the side is different from the previous life. Because of Xiao Yan's crushing tyranny, now he can't feel any dissatisfaction with Xiao Yan. He just scratched his head and said with a smile, "What good news or bad news?" Boss Xiao Yan, stop being so secretive. Wu Hao on the side just glanced at Xiao Yan and said nothing. With his taciturn temperament as a fighting madman, he was not very interested in this. As long as you can fight and fight against strong people, that's fine. On the other side, Hu Jia asked with a bit of surprise, "What other news can be considered bad news for you?" After hearing this, Xiao Yan chuckled, spread his hands, and slowly explained, "It seems that because we were too high profile, all the remaining old students from the inner courtyard were eyeing us in the following time. It is said that there are two very powerful teams of black and white evil spirits inside. The guy who was beaten away by me just now said it." Hearing these words, several people frowned slightly. Although they were a little scared at first, after following Xiao Yan for several hunts, they no longer paid much attention to the team of old students in the inner courtyard. Well, now that the news came, Xiao Yan was still a little solemn, which meant that those two teams were very strong. Sinner gently covered her mouth and spoke with a slight smile. Her voice was as clear and moving as a silver bell. "Brother Xiao Yan, please stop being so secretive. What is that good news?" After hearing Sinner's words, the corners of Xiao Yan's mouth also raised, and he said with a chuckle, "The good news is that since these two teams are the strongest, they should also have the most fire energy in quantity. If we rob them, we will unleash it." Hearing Xiao Yan's words, Hu Jia, who was a little worried before, immediately rolled her eyes. She thought there would be something wrong with Xiao Yan's emphasis on these two teams, but she didn't expect that the other party would actually say such things. "Ahem, now that I'm done with the joke, let's talk about something more formal." Xiao Yan coughed a few times, stopped laughing and joking, became serious, and slowly said, "The black and white team should not be simple. Those old students all know our current strength, but even so, they have full confidence in those two teams. I have to suspect that among those two teams, there are also due to the existence of Douling." Hearing this, Baishan, Hu Jia, Wu Hao and the other three became serious. To be fair, although they are extremely talented now and are not weak among the great fighting masters, if they want to compete with real fighting spirits, even if they are the three of them taking action together, may be a bit reluctant. If the opponent's star rating is higher, it may be a unilateral defeat by you. The gap between the great fighting master and the fighting spirit is no less than a huge gap. Xiao Yan on the side nodded slightly. Although in his previous life, when he participated in the inner courtyard fire energy hunting competition, he was only a 7-star fighter. The black and white evil teams at that time were very difficult. The black evil team is weaker, but all of them are great fighting masters. The captain is even a half-step spirit fighting master, and the white evil team captain is a true spirit fighting expert. In this life, his strength has improved by leaps and bounds. The black and white team that can be arranged by the elders in the inner circle to finish is definitely different from the previous life. It is not that simple. In that case, what should we do, fight or not? There was an obvious look of hesitation on Baishan's face. He was like this. He was greedy for life and afraid of death. He habitually retreated when faced with powerful enemies. Wu Hao on the side, holding the bloody giant sword, said lightly, "No matter what you think, I definitely want to have a fight with them." Sinner on the side also stretched out her hand, gently held Xiao Yan's rough palm, and said firmly, "No matter what Brother Xiao Yan wants to do, Sinner will support it." Hu Jia, who was on the side, scratched his head as he looked at a few people, broke the jar and said, "Okay, since you want to fight, then I will fight too." In this way, the minority obeyed the majority, and soon the 5 people reached a consensus and decided not to evade the pursuit of the two teams, but to fight in an upright manner. The next day, a piece of breaking news came out from the forest again in a high profile. It is said that the top freshman team gathered at the edge of